in a way, it's the difference between what should be and what is. It's that kind of space between the normative and the empirical that I ended up looking at. And really our norms come from learned gentlemen that at a time of revolution. So people like Thomas Hobbes in 1651, I think scared to death of the idea that some ne'er-do-well would take up leadership from an era where the divine right of kings had been long established over several centuries, that the king was the kind of presence of God, the representative of divinity. And that was really, really challenged by the English Revolution and the rising bourgeoisie. And some of the learned gentlemen like Hobbes got really scared by it because they didn't know where it was going to end up, and there was things like the Levellers and the Luddites and all those kinds of different groups that were really pushing for a kind of socialist, well, it wasn't at the time obviously, but a kind of socialist ideal of a completely flat, hierarchical, unhierarchical society. And so to some extent the idea of representation emerged out of that period where brakes were being put on a process of revolution and change by a kind of a bourgeois elite, if you like. This was later turned into another set of theories by Rousseau in France with a social contract and trying to find a way of, again, I think for the bourgeoisie to claim some right of power over the aristocracy who had this sort of divine right for so long. And 10 years after Rousseau died, the revolution happened. Similarly, I think the sort of franchise was expanded in England around the same time. There was a lot of the aristocracy were shitting themselves, to be honest, but the bourgeoisie would overthrow them and all that sort of stuff, or it would continue. And so then you've got people like Burke who were starting to frame the normative ideas of representation. And there's this, I think, by today's standard, an absolutely revolting idea that he argued that, for example, I think it was Manchester or may have been Birmingham, that they didn't need a representative at all because there were good gentlemen, there were good men in Parliament. And he used this idea of what's good for Britain as a whole is by its very nature good for Birmingham. So it didn't matter whether people actually had a representative or not. And he was a real kind of advocate of this idea that in his inaugural speech, that thanks for all the fish, but I'm no longer a member of Bristol, I'm now a member of Parliament. So now you've elected me, now I have to go off and do what, and it kind of established this idea of trusteeship as a form of representation as opposed to mandate or delegation or whatever. And again, it's about a bourgeois elite retaining power and not being, although the franchise had been extended and people could vote, more people could vote, there was no way he was going to be accountable to those people, and he was going to do what he thought was right for the interests of his own class.